The raid came without warning, like a sudden storm that swept across the plains. No one had ever expected it. No one had ever dared to dream that the brutal, slaving warlords of the galaxy would choose their insignificant world as a target. But there they were, descending from the dark sky, black ships that blocked out the stars like an eclipse. The inhabitants of Valor 9, a remote agricultural colony, were used to hardship. They had built their homes from nothing, had fought off natural disasters, and even repelled bandits and raiders in the past. But nothing had prepared them for this. The alien slavers didn't care about the history of the planet. They didn't care about its people. Their mission was simple: capture, enslave, and sell. The Valorians fought back, of course they always fought back, but the odds were too great. Their weapons were outdated, their ships too slow. Against the speed and power of the slavers' fleet, their resistance was futile. In the chaos of the attack, one prisoner stood out from the rest. His name was Adam Drake, but to the slavers he was just another human to add to their haul. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have possibly imagined, was that they had just captured something far more dangerous than they realized. The slavers dragged Drake through the smoldering ruins of what was once the colony's central hub. His hands were shackled with heavy plasma cuffs, his eyes hidden beneath a ragged hood. The slavers' laughter echoed as they hurled insults at him, but he never flinched. His face remained impassive, his body still, as if he had accepted the inevitable. "Another one for the auction block, eh?" one of the slavers jeered. His scales, a sickly green with black ridges, gleamed under the fading light. He wiped his hands on his blood-stained tunic. "Might fetch a decent price. Humans always do." "Not this one," another slaver said, his voice low, almost reverent. "He's different." The first slaver grunted. "Different how?" "He's quiet. Doesn't beg. Doesn't fight back like the others. I think he knows something we don't." The slaver captain, a tall alien with sharp, angular features and skin the color of ash, stopped in his tracks. He turned, fixing his eyes on Drake. "Name?" he demanded. The prisoner raised his head, his voice as cold as the vacuum of space. "Reaper." The captain blinked, taken aback. A ripple of recognition passed through the crew. "What did you say?" "Reaper," Drake repeated, his tone unwavering. The captain's eyes narrowed. The name was one that had been whispered in fear across the galaxy for generations. It was not a name spoken lightly. "Where did you hear that name? Does it matter?" Drake's lips twitched into the slightest of smiles, as if he were amused by their confusion. "That's my name. Reaper." The slavers exchanged uneasy glances. For a moment, the hubbub of their celebration stalled, as if the very name itself had brought a chill to the air. "You're a prisoner," the captain snapped, his voice hardening. "You'll speak when I tell you to speak. Understand?" But the prisoner's eyes were not those of someone who feared captivity. They were the eyes of a man who had long since embraced the end. The slavers finally threw him into the holding cells aboard their ship, the Vekrar, a massive vessel built for one purpose: transport. They would sell him, like the others, to the highest bidder in the galactic markets. No one cared about the names of the slaves. To the slavers they were just commodities. But that was before they knew who he was. As the slavers went about their business, unaware of the storm brewing within their own ranks, they failed to realize that the man they had just captured was a legend. A reaper of men, a survivor of wars that tore entire galaxies apart. And now, the slavers would learn what it meant to cross a man whose name echoed in the darkest corners of space. The ship's engines roared to life, pulling them away from the wreckage of the colony. The Vekrar hurtled through the void, carrying its cargo of prisoners, none of them aware of the fate that awaited them, none of them knowing that they had just crossed paths with someone capable of turning their entire empire to ash. Adam Drake, or rather Reaper, sat in the dark and waited. The slavers would learn soon enough that no cage could hold him. The name hung in the air like a curse. Reaper. The moment Adam Drake had uttered it, the entire room seemed to freeze. The captain of the slaver ship, Kalex, stood still for a long moment, his eyes narrowing as if testing the weight of the name. The rest of the crew, who had been laughing and taunting their new captive, fell silent. The tension was palpable, as if the very air had thickened with the power of that single word. "What did you say?" Kalex asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as if he feared saying it aloud would summon something dark and terrible. Reaper simply stared back, his expression cold and unreadable. "Reaper," he repeated, the word like a death sentence. The slavers knew the name. They had heard the stories, the whispers told in hushed tones across dark bars and back alleys. A name tied to a legend, one that had been passed down among certain circles. Kalex had heard the rumors. He had laughed them off as myths, but standing in front of him now, chained and unbroken, was a man who was either a ghost or the living embodiment of that very legend. "Impossible," Kalex muttered, almost to himself. "Who are you?" The question came from one of the younger slavers, a nervous, inexperienced alien who had never faced anything but weak prey. "The Reaper's dead. He was a legend. A myth." Reaper's lips twisted into a brief, bitter smile. "You're about to learn that myths don't die." A chill ran down the spine of every slaver in the room. Kalex hesitated, then signaled for the guards to drag Drake to the interrogation chamber. The captain needed to see for himself whether this prisoner was truly the same as the one spoken of in hushed legends, or if it was just another deluded human trying to make a name for himself. The chamber was cold, a stark contrast to the heat of the battle outside. The walls were lined with reinforced metal, designed to withstand the toughest of prisoners. Yet, as they locked Drake into the center of the room, he remained motionless, his gaze locked on Kalex. The slaver captain paced slowly in front of him, assessing, weighing options. He had heard the stories, how Reaper had annihilated entire war fleets, how no one could touch him and survive. Some said he was the last of an ancient warrior race, a remnant of a forgotten war. Others claimed he was something far more terrifying, a ghost, a weapon of vengeance forged in the fires of destruction. Whatever the truth was, it was clear that the man in front of him was no ordinary human. "Tell me, Reaper," Kalex said, his voice now dripping with venom, "why should I spare you? You're just one man. No one can defeat an army." Drake didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied the captain with cold, calculating eyes. Then his voice broke the silence, low and steady. "I don't need to defeat an army. Just one soldier at a time." Kalex sneered, a nervous laugh escaping his lips. "And you think you'll escape, huh? You're shackled, alone and outnumbered. I can end you in an instant." "Then why haven't you?" Reaper asked, his voice cutting through the captain's bravado. "Why haven't you ended me yet?" The question hung in the air, leaving Kalex to ponder for the briefest of moments. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the shriek of the ship's alarms, signaling an internal breach. The crew scrambled, but Kalex's attention remained fixed on Reaper, whose lips curled into a grim smile. "I didn't expect it to be this soon," Reaper muttered, almost to himself. In the chaos, Kalex's grip on his composure slipped. The prisoners, confused and frightened, were starting to stir. He turned, ready to bark orders, but before he could say a word, the lights flickered. A deep, vibrating hum echoed through the walls, a sound too precise to be a simple malfunction. Reaper's grin deepened. The captain's heart raced. The ship's systems were sabotaged. The prisoner had done something. But how? "Looks like your auction is about to be postponed," Reaper said, his voice calm, almost amused. Kalex's eyes widened as he turned back to his captive, the realization dawning on him too late. The hunt had begun. The ship shook violently, the sound of tearing metal echoing through the halls as the alarms blared louder than ever. The slaver's control center descended into chaos. Sparks flew from the walls, flickering lights casting long shadows in the narrow corridors. "What the hell is happening?" Kalex shouted, gripping the nearest console. His fingers hovered over the controls, but nothing responded. His ship, his pride, was being torn apart from within. But in the depths of the holding cells, Reaper stood motionless, a man calm in the eye of a storm. When the sabotage began, Kalex had assumed it was some malfunction, a fluke. But Reaper's smirk told a different story. The slaver captain had underestimated him, as many before had done, and now it was too late to undo his mistake. The prisoners in the holding bay were screaming, shouting for freedom as they rattled their cages. But Reaper's gaze never wavered. He didn't need the chaos, it was his ally. He'd spent years honing his body into a weapon, training to kill, to survive. This was his moment. A low hum filled the air as the cell door in front of him slid open, a crack of light piercing the darkness. Reaper stepped forward, moving with calculated precision, his shackles barely slowing him. He had no intention of running. His destination was much closer than the slavers realized. The first guard he encountered barely saw him coming. The alien stood, weapon raised, eyes wide in confusion as Reaper struck with brutal efficiency. The guard crumpled to the floor in seconds, his body twisted and broken. The rest of the crew was too distracted, too frantic to realize what was happening right under their noses. Reaper didn't hesitate. He moved through the ship like a shadow, silent, deadly. One by one he picked off the slavers who tried to stand in his way, their cries of alarm swallowed by the ship's cacophony of failing systems. Kalex's voice came over the intercom, frenzied. All units to the holding cells now. Stop him before he... But it was too late. The voice crackled and cut out as the ship lurched again, this time in a violent roll that sent several crew members crashing into walls. The sabotage was spreading. The ship was falling apart faster than the slavers could react. Reaper reached the main deck just as the central control room slid into view. The slavers had been caught off guard, their weapons drawn and ready. They stood in tight formation, blocking the door with their guns aimed at the entrance. Hold your fire. Kalex's command came too late. Reaper was already inside. With fluid movements, he ducked under the first barrage of gunfire, rolling across the floor, taking out the nearest guard in a single swift motion. Another slaver aimed his weapon, but Reaper was already there, twisting the alien's arm and snapping it with a sickening crack. The rest of the crew hesitated, too terrified to engage him directly. They had seen him move, seen how easily he dismantled their comrades. No one dared to charge. Kalex, behind the protective line of his crew, bellowed into his comms. Get reinforcements. Now. We're losing him. But even as he spoke, the light in the control room dimmed, a sign that the sabotage had reached the heart of the ship. With the flick of his wrist, Reaper disabled the security grid, flooding the control room with the low hum of victory. The slavers, now scattered and scrambling, knew they were outmatched. There was no more time to strategize. There was no plan to follow. The control room was no longer under their command. Reaper stepped over the bodies, his face unreadable. He moved toward the control console with methodical purpose. With a single strike, he disabled the lock, sending a signal to the entire ship's system. The outer docking bay doors began to open, a wide expanse of space beyond them. The slavers were losing control and they knew it. But there was nothing they could do. Reaper had already won. As the ship's systems failed completely, Reaper made his way to the docking bay. The prisoners who had been freed followed in his wake, knowing better than to question the force that had led them to freedom. Kalex, now panicked, screamed through the ship's comms, but his words were drowned out by the sound of rushing air. Reaper stood at the threshold of the bay, the cold emptiness of space stretching out before him. Behind him, the slaver ship was falling apart. One final glance back told him all he needed to know. He wasn't just escaping. He was sending a message. The Reaper had come. The slavers were coming and they weren't alone. Reaper stood at the edge of the docking bay, watching the growing fleet of enemy ships closing in on the disabled Vecrar. His pulse didn't quicken. The Reaper didn't get nervous. He didn't feel fear. What he felt now was something far more dangerous: anticipation. The escape had been too easy. The sabotage too simple. Now the slavers were regrouping, calling for reinforcements, and they were closing in. They thought they could contain him, but they had no idea what they were dealing with. The sky above him was filling with enemy ships, sleek, deadly, their weapons primed and ready. The Vecrar was crippled, its defenses offline, but Reaper had always fought with his back against the wall. And now, once again, he was facing impossible odds. He glanced back at the prisoners who had followed him out of their cells. They were terrified, wide-eyed and shaking, unsure of what to do next. A few tried to take shelter behind crates, while others whispered prayers, clutching their newfound freedom like a lifeline. Reaper had no time for distractions. He had never been a leader. He had always been a weapon. And weapons didn't lead, they acted. The sound of boots pounding on the metal floor echoed down the hall, signaling the arrival of the first wave of slaver reinforcements. There were only a few dozen, but Reaper knew they were more than capable. Kalex had dispatched the best of his men to take him down. Reaper didn't move. He didn't have to. The first of the slavers turned the corner, weapons drawn, eyes scanning for the fugitive. They didn't expect him to be standing right in front of them. Before they could react, Reaper was upon them, his fists moving faster than they could track. The first slaver went down with a sickening crunch, his neck snapped like a twig. Reaper didn't wait for the others to get their bearings. He moved with brutal efficiency, dispatching one after another. The slavers didn't stand a chance. The rest of the reinforcements came running, their blasters flashing, but they were too slow. The Reaper was faster, stronger, and deadlier than they could ever hope to be. But as the last of the slavers fell, Reaper heard the familiar hum of incoming reinforcements. This wasn't over. Kalex had been waiting for this. He had sent more than just soldiers. He had sent mercenaries, the best the galaxy had to offer. And they were already boarding their ships, ready to rain fire down on the Vecrar. Reaper's eyes narrowed. He didn't have much time. He scanned the bay quickly, assessing the situation. There was no way to outrun these ships. But he didn't need to. The key wasn't running, it was making the enemy underestimate him. The first wave of mercenaries landed with a deafening roar, their ships descending like vultures over a carcass. They were armed to the teeth, each one a walking arsenal. Reaper had faced worse, but he needed to act fast. He couldn't afford to let them take control. He turned toward the prison's control room, the one place on the ship that still held any kind of leverage. There, he knew, was the key to his next move. The mercenaries began to fan out, their weapons raised, scanning the area. Kalex's voice crackled over the comms. "Find him. Bring him alive. He's worth more to me than any of you." Reaper grinned. He wasn't going to make it easy. With a single fluid motion, he darted toward the nearest console, his fingers working quickly as he accessed the ship's control systems. The Vekrar was crippled, but it still had a few tricks up its sleeve. Reaper knew exactly what to do with them. The lights flickered, and the hum of power surged through the ship. The remaining slavers outside hesitated, unsure of what was happening. But they had no time to react. With the flick of a switch, Reaper set the self-destruct sequence in motion. The countdown began. The mercenaries didn't know it yet, but the clock was ticking. Reaper walked calmly toward the docking bay doors, his mind already set on the next step. The slavers had tried to trap him. Now, it was time for them to learn that you don't cage a man who's already died 1,000 times. And as the ship began to tremble beneath him, Reaper knew one thing for certain. The Reaper always gets the last word. The countdown was ticking, and the ship was already beginning to fall apart. Reaper stood in the heart of the chaos, unshaken by the flashing lights and blaring alarms. The Vekrar was dying, but the slavers still didn't understand what that meant. They were still scrambling, still thinking they could stop him. They couldn't. He was a force of nature, and nothing would save them now. Behind him, the corridors were flooded with mercenaries. They came in droves, weapons aimed, voices shouting orders. But it was too late. The time for talking had passed. Now it was time for the Reaper to finish what he had started. The first wave of mercenaries poured into the docking bay, their boots pounding against the metal floors as they surrounded him. Their weapons glinted menacingly in the dim light, but Reaper didn't flinch. "Where is he?" one of the mercenaries shouted, his voice frantic. "Find the human." Reaper didn't answer. He didn't need to. With the speed of a predator, he moved through them, his body flowing like water through rock. He didn't fight like a soldier. He fought like something older, something primal. Every move was calculated, every strike lethal. The mercenaries tried to bring their weapons to bear, but their shots were wide, their reactions too slow. Reaper was already gone, his hands lethal extensions of his will. A mercenary to his left raised a blaster, but Reaper was already on him, twisting the weapon from his hands and snapping his arm. The man fell to the ground, gasping, but Reaper didn't stop. He kept moving, relentless, his eyes locked on his targets. One by one the mercenaries fell. No one stood a chance. They were trained killers, the best of the best, but they were no match for the Reaper. He was faster, smarter, and far more dangerous than any of them could have imagined. Behind him, the self-destruct countdown reached its final moments. "Stop him!" Kalex screamed, his voice rising in panic. He had seen the destruction coming, but it was too late to stop it. The Vekrar was beyond saving now. The countdown was final. Reaper moved toward the ship's command center, where Kalex and the last of his soldiers were holed up. He knew the captain would be waiting, the last line of defense. Kalex had always believed he could control the situation, always thought he could outsmart the enemy. But now, in the face of the Reaper, all of his bravado meant nothing. As Reaper stepped into the control room, Kalex looked up, his eyes wide with fear. The captain was the last to face him, but he was no more prepared than the others. "Why?" Kalex asked, his voice trembling. "Why do this? You've already won. You can leave. You can." Reaper's response was a single, cold smile. "You never understood. You never saw me as more than a prisoner. You thought you could control me. But I am not a weapon you can point and fire. I am the end of everything you thought you knew." Kalex took a step back, his hand reaching for a weapon, but Reaper was already upon him. The slaver captain didn't stand a chance. His weapon clattered to the floor as Reaper disarmed him in a single, fluid motion. The last sound Kalex heard was the sharp crack of his own neck. The final mercenaries rushed in, but they were too late. Reaper had already won. Outside, the countdown reached 0. The Vekrar shuddered as the explosion tore through its core. The blast was massive, engulfing the entire ship in a brilliant burst of light. The mercenaries who had remained on board didn't have time to scream. Reaper stood at the edge of the bay, watching as the Vekrar crumbled into the void, a casualty of its own greed. The ship, the slavers, everything they had built, It was all gone now. The countdown had claimed them, but it wasn't the destruction that mattered. It was the message. No one, not even the most feared slavers in the galaxy, could hold him. Not for long. The galaxy would learn to fear the name of the Reaper once more. The silence after the explosion was deafening. Reaper stood in the shadow of the dying Vecrar, watching the wreckage scatter into space like broken pieces of a shattered empire. The slavers were gone, consumed by their own hubris. The ship, the mercenaries, the smug captains, they were all dust now, fading into the void. But Reaper was still standing, still breathing. The war had only just begun. The escape pods had launched, and the prisoners who had followed him were scattered across the remains of the slaver fleet. Most would make their way to nearby planets or hide in the asteroid fields. They were free now, but not without scars. The galaxy would forever remember the wreckage of Kalex's empire, but the true legacy of the Reaper was far from over. He didn't look back as the last of the escape pods slipped away, their occupants no longer in his care. They would find their own paths now. It was never about saving anyone, not really. It was about making them understand. Reaper, he whispered to himself. The name still hung in the air, a living thing heavy with consequence. It was the name the galaxy had feared, the name they thought they had buried in myth and legend. They had been wrong. Now it was the last thing the slavers had heard before their empire burned. His mission was far from complete. The slaver fleets had been just a beginning, a first strike in a war that had been brewing for centuries. Reaper had played his part, but he knew this was only a small piece of the puzzle. The galaxy was vast, and if the slavers thought they could wipe humanity from it, they were about to learn a brutal lesson. He turned his back to the wreckage, walking toward the small, battered ship he had commandeered from the Vecrar. The engines hummed softly, a reminder that the fight was far from over. The coordinates were already programmed. He wasn't going to stop until the galaxy understood what it meant to cross a human. As the ship powered up, Reaper's hand hovered over the control panel, hesitating for a moment. There was still one more thing to do. One more message to send. He spoke, his voice low, almost a growl. The Reaper's just getting started. The ship shot into the blackness of space, leaving the destruction behind. But the name would echo across the stars for years to come. The legend of Reaper wasn't just a name, it was a warning. For the first time in a long while, Reaper allowed himself a smile. The galaxy had thought it could control the fate of humans, shape them into something small and insignificant. They hadn't learned the most important lesson of all. Never underestimate the will of a man who has nothing left to lose. And as the ship sliced through the vast emptiness, Reaper knew one thing was certain. The Reaper never forgot. And the galaxy would remember.